It's an honor, a daunting one, to introduce to an Ohio audience of dispute resolution professionals a person who quite literally needs no introduction to this audience. Everyone knows who Kenneth Feinberg is and what he's done in the field of dispute resolution. I don't need to describe his work. I simply need to cite titles: 9/11 Special Victims Compensation Fund, Penn State, BP oil crisis, Virginia Tech shooting, and so on. So what can I add? I'm going to try to share some information about Ken that connects him in special ways to an Ohio audience, this Ohio audience, and in doing so, reaffirm the remarkable wisdom of our director, Kathy Geyer, and Conference Planning Committee's decision to invite Ken to be our featured speaker. Ken and I were classmates at New York University Law School. I don't want to exaggerate the extent of our friendship. There were 327 people in our class as we started, so clearly everyone didn't know one another. We were in different sections in our first year, so little interaction there. He became a law review member, and I certainly did not, so our paths didn't cross citing citations, checking cites. And although we were in a couple upper-level courses together, including constitutional law, Ken's from Boston, and I was and still am a New York Yankee fan. So that's a formula for friction, not collaboration. So what is it about him that I know that I can share? Here it is. There were at least 3 people early in Ken's career as a student and young lawyer with whom he studied, was mentored, and collaborated. One of those persons I knew personally, the other 2 by their sparkling reputations. And what I learned by having the good fortune to work and live in Columbus for more than two decades at the Moritz Law School were that those 3 persons with whom Ken Feinberg had worked and importantly helped mold and shape his career had Ohio counterparts, whom I believe are well known to many of us in the audience. So let me try to identify those persons who helped shape Ken's career and their Ohio counterparts. Ken studied with, was taught by, and co-authored with a beloved professor at NYU and later dean of the law school, Norman Redlich. Dean Redlich was a model lawyer. He loved to think, he loved to teach, and he loved to do the work of lawyers. Dean Redlich was credited as being the one staff lawyer among its 14 staff members who quite literally took all the individual reports and chapters prepared by others and wove it into what became known as the Warren Commission report on the assassination of President Kennedy. Shortly after we completed law school, then Mayor John Lindsay asked Professor Redlich to take a professional leave to serve as Chief Corporation Counsel for the City of New York. To use today's terminology, Dean Redlich was a, quote, pracademic. He knew that lawyering meant thinking in action. Who do I believe is his Ohio counterpart? I believe it's the late Samuel Porter. Partner in Porter Wright, a superb and engaged advocate, an inspiring adjunct professor at our Moritz Law School, and an outstanding contributor to the development and integrity of our profession, including ADR processes. Ken is a product of similar training and role modeling. As you know, Ken was appointed special master a number of years ago to help resolve the sprawling litigation involving Agent Orange. Who appointed him? The Honorable Jack Weinstein, who I just learned took inactive status from the federal court only last month at age 98. What a model. Who was Weinstein's counterpart in Ohio in terms of intellectual breadth, human decency, and unswerving commitment to justice? In my judgment, it was the late Honorable Robert Duncan. Judge Duncan, as we know, was the first African-American elected to serve in judicial office in Franklin County, then on the Ohio Supreme Court, and then appointed to the federal bench in Ohio. In 1979, he adjudicated the landmark school desegregation lawsuit involving the Columbus Public Schools. When we think of decency, humility, and human compassion, in Ohio, we think of the late Bob Duncan. Ken Feinberg worked with a comparable mentor. Finally, upon graduating from law school, Ken clerked for the eminent Stanley Fool, Chief Judge of New York State highest court called the Court of Appeals. We all know that the U.S. Supreme Court is often identified by the name of its Chief Justice, the Roberts Court, the Warren Court, the Burger Court. For a variety of reasons, that is not our convention involving state Supreme Courts. But while Ken and I were in law school, there were two notable exceptions. California was known as the Trainer Court, and New York was known as the Fool Court. Those designations recognized by the profession the imprimatur of the leadership, intellectual acumen, and integrity of their court leaders, Roger Trainer and Stanley Fool. Who is our Ohio counterpart? Of course, it is the late, beloved Chief Justice Thomas Moyer, the Moyer Court. Among the many remarkable contributions that Chief Justice Moyer made to our civic lives was his incomparable model of civility and his passionate belief in making the justice system accessible through ADR and other initiatives to every citizen in Ohio. Ken, a Fool graduate, a Stanley Fool graduate, embraces and models those virtues. Introducing Ken Feinberg, then, to this Ohio audience is a remarkable privilege, for it is to welcome to our program a person whose love of lawyering, commitment to justice, and model of civility exemplifies and links us to the rich heritage that we Ohioans are so lucky to enjoy. I am honored to introduce you to my colleague and friend, Kenneth Feinberg.
Don't you love that Ohio tan? I mean, that's a fabulous tan, Ohio. I'm really honored to be here. This is the toughest ticket in town. You can't get into this place to see it. I'm really glad to be here. You know, a reference to Judge Weinstein, who left the bench last week at 98, and on the way out the door said to the interviewer, when asked what he'd like to do now, he said, "I'd really like to get a graduate degree in history." So Weinstein is an extraordinary human being, and he still has it all, and physically frail, of course, but still practicing. Now, in that wonderful introduction from my colleague at NYU, no mention of two other aspects more recent that you guys ought to be aware of. One is you can go back and read my memoir about my experience in designing and administering the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. That book is entitled, What is Life Worth? And that book is available. Now, you may have trouble finding it on Amazon these days, but don't worry. If Kathy just lets me know who wants a copy, my personal supply of that memoir is virtually inexhaustible. And we'll certainly be able to get you a copy. The other thing is, if you don't like to read, just be on notice. There is a movie coming out late this spring based on that book called Worth. And it's a movie based on my book about 9/11 and the fund. Michael Keaton plays me. And Amy Ryan plays my colleague. Stanley Tucci's in it. And we saw it at the Sundance Film Festival. And get glowing reviews. You can go and read the reviews. But it'll be coming to Ohio. And all those people that couldn't make it here today can certainly go to their local movie theater, and there's one in Sarasota, Chet, I'm sure, and see it to your heart's content. Now, why did I agree to come here today? And I just received praise for coming here despite the virus and the problems. I was already here. Kathy made sure that she didn't cancel this till about midnight. I was sleeping at the local inn So of course I'm here. I was expecting to be here. No, but I'm really glad to be here for really a couple of reasons. First, obviously, the interest here in what I do and the whole subject of ADR and the fact that you guys are here today is evidence that the entire subject matter, far different from when we were in law school together, is important. And here in particular at Ohio State, it is a priority. And I'm glad to be here for that reason. I'm secondly glad to be here because Nancy Rogers is here. And she is an idol of mine because Nancy Rogers, along with a handful of other academics, over the last 25, 30 years, has placed ADR as a mainstream part of a law school curriculum. And Ohio State and what Nancy did, and Pepperdine, Tom Stepanovich, and what he's done out at Pepperdine, those two law schools are the flagship schools in the nation when it comes to ADR. And for me to have a chance just to say hello to one of my heroes, Nancy, and have a chance to chat with a small group and take questions, worth it for me to be here. And finally, I'm here because of what Kathy has done in setting up this entire day's program. I looked at the program as to what was intended: workshops, plenary sessions, discussion of micro issues that impact the scope and success of ADR. And it's just to be a part of it, just to be a part of a group or a day's celebration of something that's become a very important public policy initiative. Glad to be here. That's the introduction. Now, most of this group knows exactly what I do. My normal day is not unconventional responses to unique catastrophes. Unique catastrophes, it's a relative term, but a 9/11 attack or a BP oil spill or a GM ignition switch problem, where public policy decisions are made to create an alternative to the conventional litigation system, exceedingly rare. Very rare. You know, this talk about my role in administering and designing alternatives to the tort system, believe me, it's not a full-time preoccupation. I can put on one hand the number of programs I've established where if a person voluntarily decides to take compensation from the 9/11 fund, from the BP oil spill fund, from the General Motors ignition switch program, that person signs a release. I will not sue. I'll take the money Feinberg offers, and I will not sue. Very, very rare. Those programs are aberrations from the normal way we resolve disputes. You hire your lawyer, I'll hire my lawyer, judge and jury will decide. That's not going to change. That's the American legal system, the adversary system, trial advocacy, and it is so ingrained in the history of the country. It will never change. What I do in developing these rare, unconventional responses is a sideshow. It's a precedent for nothing. They are one-off responses to a unique tragedy. The 9/11 fund, you'll never see that again, ever. Public money to compensate private victims? It's a great program and it worked just as intended, but it's not American. It's not the American way. You know, a few people get the benefit of a very special, generous program. Everybody else, fend for yourself. No. Over 1,000 people died after Katrina and the floods in New Orleans. I didn't see any 9/11 public fund created for over 1,000 deaths. No. There was not even a discussion about it. It's so out of the mainstream. So these programs, I mentioned three, 9/11, BP, GM. Unique. Aberrations. Now, you might say, well, what about all of these other programs you've done? The Boston Marathon, and Josh mentioned the Boston Marathon, and Virginia Tech, and Aurora, Colorado, the Dark Knight movie shootings, and Sandy Hook with the first graders who were killed, and the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, a terrorist attack, 49 dead. You designed those programs, you paid that money. Yeah, but those aren't alternatives to the tort system. All of those programs, it's a gift. The private citizens send in money. They donate. They watch cable news. They see the tragedy. Oh, my goodness, write a check. The Boston Marathon, in 60 days, 100,000 donors voluntarily gave $61 million. Unheard of. Unheard of. 61. Orlando, Pulse nightclub, private contributions, $31 million. You know what you learn when you do what I do? Never underestimate the charitable impulse of the American people. It's a characteristic. I think it goes back to John Winthrop, the city on the hill, the Puritans in the 1600s. And it's never left as a strain of America's character. After tragedy, no red, blue, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat. Everybody chips in. Everybody chimes in. It's apolitical. Apolitical. And it's part of our character. And it's a fabulous thing. But all of those gift programs where nobody signs a release and everybody gets money to do what you want. It's unrestricted. The American people want you victims or offspring, family members, to have that money. And it's do whatever you want with it. Hire a lawyer if you want. As opposed to the 9/11 fund, BP oil, GM ignition switches. I hereby take this money and sign a release that I will not resort to an alternative dispute mechanism, the trial. Big difference between them. The public doesn't understand. Public thinks that all of these programs are in the same bucket. They're not. Most of them are 501c3 gifts with no implication whatsoever to the tort system. The other programs are alternatives, but they are exceedingly rare. And they ought to remain rare because they create elitism. An application of law just to certain people. You should have read during the 9/11 fund, you should have read some of the emails, not emails, back then, the ancient times, letters that I received. Dear Mr. Feinberg, my wife died in Oklahoma City during the Albert Murrah bombing by a domestic terrorist. Where's my check? Dear Mr. Feinberg, I don't get it. My wife died in the basement of the World Trade Center in the original 1993 attacks committed by the very same type of people. Where's my check? And it wasn't just terrorism. Dear Mr. Feinberg, last year my wife saved 3 little girls from drowning in the Mississippi River, and then she drowned a heroine. Where's my check? You better be careful when you set up public compensation, taxpayer money, just for you people. Everybody else, fend for yourself. But for you people, motivation, patriotism, save the airlines from lawsuits, whatever the reason. You people get a special program, nobody else. Programs like 9/11 need not be studied in law school. They ought to be studied in a history class. A one-off response to a unique tragedy. That's where you look at the 9/11 fund. Lawyers who jump up screaming and shouting that these programs are a threat to the rule of law. Calm down. Very rare. a precedent for nothing. I wouldn't read too much into it myself. And yet they work. The 9/11 fund was a success. 97% of all the people who lost a loved one on 9/11 voluntarily came into the program. Only 94 people opted out. They all settled their cases 5 years later. Some got more, some got less, but after you give a third to your attorney, I think probably the right move was the 9/11 fund. The 9/11 fund did exactly what Congress intended. Divert people voluntarily through incentives, namely generosity, out of the tort system into a different designed program. It worked. Don't ever do it again. It was a one-off, you see. And people ask me all the time, what was the toughest part of the 9/11 fund? I mean, how do you value a life? That's not hard. Valuing lives in our legal system, it's done every day in every court in Columbus, around the country. Everybody who knows how the legal system works knows exactly how you value lives. What would the victim have earned over a work life? Economic loss, Chapter 7 of the Ohio State Law School tort textbook. What would the person have earned over a work life? Add pain and suffering and emotional distress equals an award. The American legal system and Ken Feinberg in 9/11 or these other programs doesn't value lives based on dignity, integrity, good works, charitable impulse, family man, great woman, charitable. That has nothing to do with the cold calculation of damage when a family loses a loved one. That's not the hard part. That's not rocket science. I'll tell you what is debilitating. What's debilitating in setting up these programs, these unconventional responses, is the emotion. The emotion. It's a killer. When you set up programs very quickly after the tragic event, and you, as you must, invite any survivor or victim who survived or family member of a lost loved one to come and see you one-on-one in confidence, you better brace yourself. You better brace yourself for what you're going to hear. Because when people come to see me in private, it is a debilitating experience that you really never recover from. Because what you hear in private, a law degree, an NYU, even an NYU law degree, Josh. Now, it's a wash. Better a divinity degree or a degree in psychiatry. Because you hear one-on-one very angry people. Very angry, disappointed, frustrated people who come to see you voluntarily, and they never, ever come to talk about money. That's not why they want to see you. They come to vent about life's unfairness. I lost my daughter. What an angel. She never harmed anybody. And she died in the World Trade Center. Don't tell me there's a God, Mr. Feinberg. No God could ever let that happen to my daughter. Or they come quietly to validate the memory of a lost loved one. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my wife. We were married for 25 years. She died in the Pentagon. And now that I'm here for a private hearing with you, I want to show you a video of our wedding 25 years ago. I want you to see my angel. Well, Mr. Jones, you don't have to show that video. It'll have no bearing on compensation. And you're going to watch. I want you to see what those murderers did. Play the video, the wedding. Validation, acknowledgement, somebody to talk to. Nancy Rogers wrote years ago, as part of the ADR process, providing an opportunity for the claimant, the victim, the wronged to be heard. Due process, critical. Critical to the success of all these programs. Now, half the people never want to see me. They grieve in private. On the anniversary date of the horror, when everybody is lighting a candle down at the World Trade Center, half the people get on a cruise and disappear for 2 weeks. They want nothing to do with remembrance and celebration. They grieve in private. The other half, it's part of the grieving process. They want to be heard. They want to vent. And that's what you do. But I'll tell you, you better brace yourself when you take on these assignments, because the people in this audience here, the few believers, you could do what I do. You could calculate damages if you have the fortitude psychologically to take it, because it is, it shakes you to the core. 9/11. Lady came to see me, 24 years old, sobbing. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my husband at the World Trade Center. He was a fireman. And he left me with our 2 children, 6 and 4. Now you're going to give me $2.4 million from the 9/11 fund, tax-free. I want it in 30 days. I said to her, Mrs. Jones, this is public taxpayer money. I've got to make the request to the U.S. Treasury. They pay it out of petty cash, but they've got to do their due diligence. They've got to check, are there any liens on your property, any tax No! 30 days, I want my money. Why do you need the money in 30 days? Why? I'll tell you why, Mr. Feinberg. I have terminal cancer. I have 10 weeks to live. My husband was going to survive me and take care of our 2 little ones. Now they're going to be orphans. I have got to get this money while I still have my faculties. I've got to set up a trust, find a guardian. I haven't got much time. You got to help me. Well, we ran down to the Treasury. We processed, walked it through, and got her paid in 30 days. 8 weeks later, she died. Now, you may think you're ready for any of this. Your law school degree isn't going to help you. I'll tell you that. This is rabbinic. It's the work of a priest, not a lawyer. That's the tough part. One more. What would you have done? A lady comes in to see me. I thought she was going to collapse. She was so distraught. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my husband at the World Trade Center. He was a fireman. And he left me with our 3 kids, 6, 4, and 2. He was Mr. Mom. Every day that he wasn't at the firehouse, he was home, teaching our 6-year-old how to play baseball, teaching our 4-year-old how to read, reading a bedtime story to the 2-year-old. Mr. Mom, what a cook. He cooked all our meals. He was the gardener around the house, planting the flowers. Mr. Feinberg, the only reason I haven't gone up to the roof of my home and jumped to join him are the 3 children. But without Mr. Mom, my life is over. Over. And we helped her out of the office. The next day, I get a telephone call from a lawyer in Queens. Mr. Feinberg, you met yesterday with Mrs. Jones and the 3 kids, 6, 4, and 2, and Mr. Mom? I go, yes. Tragic. Now look, Mr. Feinberg, you got a tough job. I don't envy what you have to do. I really don't. But I got to tell you something. She doesn't know that Mr. Mom has 2 other kids by his girlfriend in Queens, 5 and 3. And I'm telling you this because I represent the girlfriend. And when you cut your check from the 9/11 fund, there's not 3 surviving children, there's 5 surviving children. But I'm sure you'll do the right thing. Click, he hangs up, you see. Do you tell her? Do you tell her? Do you tell her about this double life that her husband was leading? Or do you keep your mouth shut? Well, we went around and around on this on the 9/11 staff. We were befuddled by this one. Finally, 3 a.m. one night, I wake up in a cold sweat. My wife goes, "What's the matter?" Well, this woman with the two double lives, and do we tell her? Don't you dare tell her. What a mistake that would be. Well, that solved our problem in the 9/11 fund. We cut one check to her and her 3 kids, and without her knowledge, we did a separate calculation. I had the discretion. We did a separate calculation and cut a separate check to the girlfriend as the guardian of the 2 kids. That was it. Now, that was almost 20 years ago, I'll bet you. Today, they know each other or whatever, but not my place, not my role to pile on with her tragedy by adding something more. We just did it that way. But that, you see, that is the problem. When you talk about unconventional responses, tailoring the law, it's not so much tailoring the law as articulating a response one-on-one to people in grief. And that is very, very hard to do. You better develop a real sense of empathy. And believe me, I've done so many of these, whether it's an alternative to the tort system or whether it's a gift. It doesn't really matter because the emotion's the same. The legal technicalities may be very different, but the emotion's the same. And empathy, you learn when you meet with people. The less you say, the better. There's nothing you can say that will be very ameliorative or helpful to the psyche of a survivor. And you make mistakes every time I do this. 9/11, I'll never forget, a blunder beyond belief. An old man came to see me, about 85, tears. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my son at the Pentagon. When the plane hit, he escaped. He worked there. He escaped. But he thought that his sister was trapped. She also worked at the Pentagon. He ran back into the burning building to try and find his sister. His sister had already escaped through a side door, a different exit. He died looking for her. And this old man said, Mr. Feinberg, my life is over. A father should never, ever have to bury a son. I'm just going through the motions. And I looked at him, empathetic guy that I am, and I said to him, Mr. Jones, this is so awful. I know how you feel. This guy looks at me, he took his hand and patted my shoulder. Mr. Feinberg, I want to give you some friendly advice. Don't tell people like me that you know how I feel. You have no idea how I feel. And it sounds hollow, robotic, pretentious. Don't do that. I'll never do that again. But you make mistakes. You're in uncharted territory, and it's hard. Every one of these unconventional responses, there's different problems, right? No 2 are exactly the same. The BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, I received in 16 months designing and administering that plan 1,250,000 claims from 50 states. I got 23 claims from Ohio. I didn't know the oil got to Ohio. 23 claims from Ohio. 50 states and 35 foreign I got claims from Norway, Germany, China. Pay me, pay me, pay me. The oil. We paid in 16 months $6.5 billion. Got 250,000 releases, received 250,000 releases, paid less than half the claims. 550,000 paid with a release. I will not sue BP. And the remainder ineligible. Ineligible. Now, some of these claims for business damage now, wage loss. Mr. Feinberg, I'm a fisherman. I fish commercially in the Gulf. They closed the oil closed the fishing grounds. I lost $100,000. Pay me. All right. What proof do you have that you lost $100,000? We do things with a handshake down here. Well, you may do things with a handshake, but I'm not paying without proof. Do you have a tax return? No. Do you have something, a checkbook, profit and loss? Well, he gave me something in crayon. We looked it over, and we said to him, well, all right, based on what you've shown us, we're going to cut you a check from the fund for $100,000. Now, with it, we're sending you a 1099 from the IRS. Guy looks at me and he says, you're going to send me a 1099? I go, yeah. He goes, well, I waive it. You can't waive a 1099. I've got to send you the 1099. You can't waive a 1099. He says, you're going to really send that to me? I go, yeah. He goes, rip up my claim. I go, wait a minute. You're going to get a 1099, and for that, you're going to rip up a $100,000 check. Rip it up. Okay. Probably never paid taxes in his life. But we ripped it up. That was a huge volume of claims. At one point in BP, we had 4,300 people working for us. And all of these, the Boston Marathon, you talk about emotion and dealing empathetically. Boston Marathon bombing on Patriot Day. I get a call from a victim who lost, the marathon blew his leg off, his left leg at the hip. The shrapnel blew off his leg. And he calls me from Spalding, the rehab hospital in Boston. He says, Mr. Feinberg, I know you're available for victims to meet with, but I'm still in rehab and I can't come and see you. I said, that's all right. I'll come over to Spalding, to your hospital. I'll come visit you and I'll explain the program. I get in a taxi. I go over to Spalding. I go up to his hospital bedroom. And there he is lying in bed, no left leg, and on his lap is his 8-year-old son, and around the bed, his wife, his mother, and his brother. And I said to him, I said, Mr. Jones, this is awful, awful. I'm here to give you, from the One Fund Boston, $1,250,000. He looks at me. He says, you're going to give me $1,250,000. I said, that's right. He goes, I got a better idea, Mr. Feinberg. Keep the money. Give me my leg back. How's that? Give me my leg back. You can keep the $1,250,000. I want my leg. Mr. Jones, I wish I had that power. All I can do is this. Yeah, great. Thanks for nothing. Oh, I left. Nothing you can say. What are you going to put? I'm not going to get in a fight with him. What am I going to do? There's no reasoning with that. Guy is perfectly understandable. That's the problem with these programs. If you do them right and you tailor the program to the individual victim and give them the opportunity to be heard, whatever they want to talk about, that's the heart and soul of these programs. That's why they're so successful. I don't think what I do is a success because we're creative legally. But in every one of them, right now, I've got an unconventional response. Boeing. Boeing comes to me and says, Ken, we'll pay you. We want you to distribute $50 million to the families of the passengers who died, 346 of them, on the two MAX 737 crashes. This is not an alternative to the tort system. This is a gift from Boeing, reputational. We want to show our sorrow. And why don't you distribute $50 million to each of 346 family survivors? And do it any way you want. But you do it, not Boeing. We're in the aircraft manufacturing business. We're not in the claims business. You know what you're doing. You do it. Well, how do you distribute to 346 families $50 million? Well, some decisions are easy. Every family will get $144,500. We're not going to make distinctions based on financial need or whatever. Those passengers who died on those two planes lived in 35 foreign countries: Kenya, Rwanda, Somalia, Italy, Germany, the Sudan. First of all, try finding those families. Try finding them. Some live in the middle of an African village. How are you even going to find the people to tell them about the program? You better have people on the ground working for you. Go into the land, Rwanda. Go find the person. Second, once you find them, who gets the money? Who gets the money? Mr. Feinberg, I was the spouse of the victim. Pay me. Mr. Feinberg, I was also the spouse of the victim. Pay me. Mr. Feinberg, I'm the third spouse of the victim under Rwandan law. Pay me. Well, I haven't seen that very often. 3 spouses all claiming they want the money. Well, what does Rwandan law say about that? Spare me. We went to the Library of Congress, and with Boeing's help, we found out the intestacy law of Rwanda. But I mean, you know, try translating it. Very difficult. Took us 3 months to find the family in the Sudan, but we did. And then you have another problem. Even if you can decide, we're going to send that spouse $144,500. You are? How do you know it's going to end up in her pocketbook? How do you know that Rwanda isn't going to pass a law? We have decided to impose a 90% tax on any money that you get from Boeing, and that money will end up in a Swiss bank account. I mean, how do you make sure the money is impactful of the very people you're trying to get the money to? And then, of course, there's the issue. I mean, we stay away from it, but it is an issue. You give somebody in Kenya $144,000. The annual wage in Kenya, on average, is $998. You give somebody $144,000, they'll buy a Ferrari. How do you know what they'll do with that money? They're one of the richest people in Kenya. You got to know when to say, that's none of my business. You want to spend the money? I mean, do you know that after the 9/11 fund, we invited any family who lost a loved one on 9/11, we're going to get millions of dollars. We will provide you 2,893 people who died in the fund. 2,893, we will give all of you, with the money, free financial planning with Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, whatever. Free. To give you some options as to how to invest that type of money. All of the 2,893 got the invitation. I think 95 accepted it. Everybody else said, nope, we're not checking off the box. We know what we want to do with the money. You know, my uncle, there's a Bolivian gold mine, whatever. We know what we're going to do. Fine. Your choice. So that's really conventional responses to unique, tailoring the law. Tailoring the law, that's right. You have to tailor the law in some of these rare 9/11 type alternatives to the tort system. Not much tailoring of the law if it's a private, charitable donation and you're giving out money, dispensing it, distributing it after tragedy. Not really tailored that much. But regardless of what you do in this area, you better have a course in psychiatry because you better take a break during the administration of these programs, go outside and walk around the block a little bit, buy an ice cream cone, see kids playing in a playground. You'll go mad with these individual stories of tragedy. The programs work. They're successful. They are rare, and they should remain rare. And the final point I would make is one of the real problems with all of these programs that are designed and administered, they are un-American in the sense that there are no checks and balances. You know, you delegate Congress, the president, BP, whatever. You delegate, a mayor of Boston, you delegate to one person. Can you do it? I'm not the one that asks that they be done. Policymakers decide that. They come to me, we're going to do this, and we want you to do it. No committees, no appeals. The courts are silent. These are extrajudicial. They are a parallel dispute resolution mechanism. But delegating all that authority to one person, it runs counter to a course in administrative law, I'll tell you that. There's very little in the way of checks and balances other than public opinion, which is important. Voluntary, the programs are never, ever mandated. If a person goes through the program and doesn't like what she's receiving, she can opt out, do whatever else she wants. But I close by saying that unconventional responses should remain unconventional. They should be tied to unique catastrophic events. I mean, 9/11, the Civil War, Pearl Harbor, the assassination of President Kennedy, and 9/11. Those are sort of the top tier of tragedies, public tragedies in the United States. So that's sort of the type of program I would have given if the place was packed. But I've got the true believers here. That's good. And let's spend, according to Kathy's wise timer, you got to go back and get your tan replenished by tomorrow. Let's take questions from the experts. You guys know about as much about this as I do, so fire away. Two answers. Answer number one is obviously the program, court-sponsored, court-centered, promotes speed and efficiency. If you do go into this program, court-related, court-sponsored, you will get a mediation within X time and a decision within Y time. And it is vastly preferable to getting strangled in court procedure and court uncertainty. Mediation, you control your destiny. It's non-binding. You have the certainty of knowing that if you don't want it, it won't get done, and if you do want it, it will get done. You're not rolling the dice in the courtroom. You raise a very interesting issue. I've always been of two minds about court-mandated mediation. On the one hand, I'm against it. Forcing somebody to mediate, I mean, there's an 85% chance you'll fail. If the person doesn't voluntarily want to try and get to yes, ordering her to try and get to yes is, I think, uphill sledding. So on the one hand, I've never been a fervent supporter of mandated anything. On the other hand, I've learned that sometimes mandated mediation compels somebody, a claimant, a plaintiff, a defendant, to wake up and see the value of a non-binding process. They would have never tried it in the first place, but for having their eyes opened by the fact they have no choice. So that tempers somewhat my criticism of mandated, because in this world, how many people really enjoy, that aren't in this room, understand the benefits of mediation? And if mandated channeling people into mandated ADR is the only way to get their eyes opened, maybe it's not such a bad idea. I don't know. It's interesting. Also, I would say this, and it's an interesting question. How many judges out there really are willing to actively promote ADR under their umbrella of the judiciary? For every, Josh mentions, for every Jack Weinstein, Judge Fallon in New Orleans, Judge Chuck Breyer, Northern District of California in San Francisco, Judge Polster, who's got the opioid cases here. For every judge like that, well-versed, acclaimed for their hands-on ADR intervention, I often see judge after judge after judge, not my role. I'm the umpire. If they want to do it, let them do it, but don't ask me to soil my hands. ADR is a parallel, not part of, a judicial process. And I still think today there are many, many, many judges who aren't really all that enthusiastic about anything other than, here's what I'm supposed to do. Here's what I'm supposed to do. And I'm not going to get involved in settlement, mediation, or alternative dispute. No. I'm ready to pick a jury. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying that there are advantages to court-sponsored, especially if the court-sponsored mechanism can be swift, cost-effective, and efficient. Those are three characteristics that don't apply to the usual legal system. And if you can do that, that's incentivizing. Aren't we seeing more and more of that with judges with victim impact statements, the opportunity to be heard in the courtroom at sentencing, the opportunity, that's in criminal, on the criminal side, but on the civil side, the opportunity to invite the victim or the plaintiff with the defendant into the chambers of the judge to speak, not so much about settlement as just to understand the nature of the case and clear out some of the underbrush about how the system works. I know that Judge Weinstein in the DES anti-pregnancy cases, the tort cases, he invited plaintiff lawyers and Eli Lilly, the manufacturer of DES, to come into the chambers. No reporter. Now look, I'm not going to be involved in the sentencing, in the mediation, anything like that. I just want both of you to understand that there are advantages to avoiding a trial and blah, blah, and I wanted you to each talk with one another, etc. The other thing he did is during pre-trial DES cases, he would invite the victim into his chambers with her lawyer, just to chat about the vagaries of the uncertainties of the legal system and just be sort of a father figure. Again, there aren't many judges that would be willing to do that. There really aren't. But I think, yes, I think your next book ought to be, how the judiciary might take some lessons from mediation, ADR, Feinberg, claims programs, the hearings in those programs, and try and transmit some of that to the judiciary, maybe. In these employment discrimination cases, especially age discrimination, where a person's laid off after being on the job 30 years or something, and they sue, I find that the single most helpful way to mediate a successful settlement of an age discrimination case is for somebody from the company to participate in the mediation and apologize to this woman. Apologize. Mrs. Jones, you worked with us for 30 years. We are so sorry. We're downsizing and going with younger people. But what you did for us for 30 years, we are so grateful and we apologize. Case settled. I walk out, They did it for me. So lawyers sometimes might not like that on either side, but it works. Yes, ma'am. Two great questions, each of which could be the subject of an Ohio State Law School seminar, because you're raising very, very interesting public policy issues. Now, I'd like to say that I met with 950 families and took the time myself to meet with them, and I did. I thought it was very important that the head of the program, the visible government official responsible for the program, meet in confidence with the family. Now, there were about 500 that I couldn't do. I just didn't have time. And I had deputies meet with those people. So I think it was important that I do it, but eventually the volume can overwhelm you and you have no choice. But even then, I found that as long as it's a deputy of the program, not an outside lawyer, a deputy working, and if anybody objected and said, no, I want Feinberg, well, we managed to, not many did, but we managed to deal with that as well. I then met with them. But I think that's important, that the visible face of the program, the guy who's on TV promoting the program, be the guy that's meeting and giving the opportunity for a family member to meet with the person who's the face of the program. I thought that was important to the success of the hearing. Now, as to disclosure, I don't know about that. That is a very thorny question. On the one hand, we in the 9/11 Fund and in all of our programs have a certain degree of public disclosure. We don't tell anybody who we're meeting with privately. We don't tell anybody the Mrs. Jones got $3 million. We don't provide any disclosure that would permit a news story or anybody else to figure out that Mrs. Jones got $3 million. Mrs. Jones comes to me and says, Mr. Feinberg, don't you dare tell anybody that I was here, I got $3 million. My children will be kidnapped and held for ransom. So what we did, especially 9/11, which was public money, we had to give aggregate information. 101 people saw us in the last 30 days, and we dispensed, $163 million to 101 people. Sometimes we went a little further, and of those 101 people, 38 were widows of firemen. So we gave aggregate statistics, but we never disclosed. Now, we publicly, in a very transparent way, explained how the program works, the protocols, what you have to submit, the right to be heard, the release that's required. All of that was public. But the details surrounding individual claims, very, very guarded about that. I'm not sure where I come down on public disclosure in the courts. I think the courts in some ways benefit from the fact that it is a little bit mystical and murky, a little bit dark. We're not sure how the system works, but it seems to work pretty well because the American people adhere to it. how much more the courts should be willing to disclose in the way of settlements, in the way of victim impact statements. I'm sort of on the fence on that one, because I'd want to know a little bit more about how much more disclosure would impact the credibility and the respect for the third branch. And there, I've slowly come around to the view that probably radio and TV broadcast of Supreme Court argument probably now I think is a good idea. But I can be convinced otherwise. There's something mystical about the Supreme Court. The less people know about it, maybe the better. I don't know. But it's an interesting issue for further discussion. One more? Last one. That's a good question. The future of mediation and ADR. One, ADR is here to stay. It's becoming, thanks to people like Nancy Rogers and others, more and more part of the mainstream dispute resolution processes in the United States. Forget abroad. It's never going to catch on abroad. Abroad, they don't have the crazy legal system we do. But here in the United States, I think it's becoming more and more an option. I think to anybody who is looking toward the future and wants to become more immersed in it, get as much experience as you can. The courts in most states and federal courts now have these voluntary panels where you can get pro bono experience in mediating and helping parties try and get to yes. I think joining bar associations and other organized ADR promotional professional associations like the dispute resolution program with the ABA is a great idea. Networking. Get as much experience as you can. A lot of my students, when they go to law firms after they graduate, they say to the law firm, I'd like your firm, will I be able to get some mediation experience? Will I be able to help represent a client in mediation? I'd like to be at the table. I'd like to see how it works. I'd like to become more familiar with it in practice. Any way you can get more experience, it's becoming increasingly a very competitive profession. Every ex-judge, every ex-corporate general counsel, I want to mediate. I bring us expertise. Getting into that realm, it's highly competitive. But I've learned that all you need is one big opportunity. If I hadn't done, Josh mentioned, if I hadn't done Agent Orange with Jack Weinstein, my career might have been entirely different. Once we settled Agent Orange in 1984 with front page news, the Vietnam veterans have settled, everybody started to come to me. It built up. And then 9/11, when Attorney General Ashcroft selected me, it bolted me. I can tell you exactly, Agent Orange and 9/11 set me on this path. Those two cases, more than anything else. So, sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart. And I was in the right place on these. And I close with this story. Agent Orange. First day, I'm the mediator. Never took a course. We didn't even have a course in mediation at NYU then. Now they have a clinic. I meet around a table. On the one hand are 6 lawyers representing 250,000 Vietnam veterans claiming disease and injury due to the herbicide, Agent Orange exposure while serving in Vietnam. On the other side of the table are the 8 chemical defendants, chemical companies, Dow, Monsanto, Hercules, etc. So I'm the great mediator. Vietnam veterans, what is your opening demand to settle this case? Mr. Feinberg, our opening demand is $1,200,000,000. 8 chemical companies. Together, collectively, what are you offering to settle? Mr. Feinberg, our opening offer collectively to settle is $25,000. I said, now we're making progress. 8 weeks later, as you know, it's settled for $250 million. And if you're a mediator, you better be dogged and you better have more competence about the merits and demerits of the case than the lawyers do. And if you're dogged and you're determined and you're creative, you can find a way to get to yes. I am glad I came. I'm sorry that so many people couldn't get in because it was sold out and they couldn't get a seat. But this was a really great group. This is what it's all about. And I thank Josh particularly, but I thank all of you for being here, and I'll be back. Thank you.